Officer Mark Reynolds stood in front of his bathroom mirror, tightening the knot of his tie with meticulous precision. His graying hair was neatly combed back, the lines on his face telling the story of over 2 decades in law enforcement. At 48, he exuded a no-nonsense demeanor, his steel-blue eyes reflecting a hardened resolve. Mark had always believed in law, order, and a clear-cut distinction between right and wrong. Raised in a conservative household in a small Midwestern town, these values were instilled in him from an early age. As he strapped on his badge and holstered his gun, he felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. In his mind, the world had become more chaotic, and his role was to restore balance. His routine was rigid: early morning workouts, precision in paperwork, and unwavering discipline in the field. He prided himself on being thorough. Yet beneath his tough exterior was a man who struggled with the complexities of a rapidly changing society. He often wrestled with his place in this new reality, where old rules didn't always apply. But he suppressed these doubts, telling himself that staying firm was the only way to maintain order. Miles Carter, a 17-year-old with a towering athletic build, laced up his worn-out sneakers, preparing for another day at Lincoln High. His dark brown skin glistened in the early morning sun as he jogged down the cracked sidewalks of his neighborhood, headphones in, nodding to the rhythm of hip-hop beats. Despite the external wear of his surroundings, Miles carried a radiant energy, his eyes brimming with hope and determination. A star student and the captain of his school's debate team, Miles was known for his sharp intellect and unwavering ambition. He had dreams of becoming a civil rights attorney, a goal he held close to his heart since witnessing his father's wrongful arrest when he was just 12. That incident ignited a passion within him to fight for justice and equality, shaping his identity. Despite the challenges of growing up in an underfunded community riddled with systemic issues, he remained optimistic, leaning on the support of his mother and younger sister. Miles' world was vibrant and full of potential, yet shadowed by the societal challenges he couldn't ignore. Mark's suburban neighborhood was a world of manicured lawns, wide streets, and pristine houses with white picket fences. Every morning, he drove past the same rows of neatly trimmed hedges, exchanging nods with neighbors who waved from their porches. His world was orderly, predictable, and insulated from the chaos he often encountered on duty. This neighborhood was a bubble, a stark contrast to the urban sectors he patrolled. Miles' world was different. His neighborhood thrived on resilience. The sidewalks were cracked, the storefronts worn, but there was a vibrancy that couldn't be suppressed. Street vendors sold their goods on the corners. Children played basketball in makeshift courts, and murals painted stories of both struggle and triumph. Despite the hardships, there was a strong sense of community. Neighbors looked out for one another, and the local community center served as a beacon of hope for the youth. This urban landscape was where Miles found his strength, yet it was also where he faced the harsh realities of prejudice. Every walk home from school carried the possibility of unwanted encounters with law enforcement. He couldn't help but feel the weight of societal expectations pressing down on him, the unspoken narrative that young black men were to be watched with suspicion. One morning, as Mark listened to the police radio during his commute, a breaking news story caught his attention: a rise in petty crimes attributed to local youth gangs. The news anchor's voice dripped with caution, but Mark's mind latched onto one detail: teens in hoodies reported near the downtown area. His grip on the steering wheel tightened. His mind flashed to the countless reports he'd processed and the recent briefings emphasizing vigilance in these sectors. Miles, unaware of the brewing storm, was focused on his upcoming debate competition. Walking home from school that evening, he passed a group of kids hanging out near the corner store. He didn't stop, but he felt their eyes on him. He shook it off, his mind on his future. But what neither he nor Mark realized was that their worlds were on a collision course, one shaped by assumptions and the invisible line drawn between their realities. It was a crisp fall evening when Miles decided to take a detour on his way home from the community center. He had stayed late preparing for an upcoming debate competition, and now the streets were quiet under the dim glow of flickering streetlights. As he walked past a local electronics store, he noticed the shattered glass window. The alarm was silent, but the damage was evident. Shelves overturned, merchandise scattered. Instinctively, Miles stopped, pulling out his phone to call for help. Unbeknownst to him, Officer Mark Reynolds was on a routine patrol nearby, alerted to the area due to a reported break-in. The description was vague: teen, male, hoodie. As Mark approached the scene, his headlights illuminated Miles, standing just feet from the broken window with a phone in hand. His instincts kicked in. Mark immediately pulled over, his hand hovering over his holster as he exited the car. His voice cut through the night air. "You, hands where I can see them." The authoritative command echoed, sharp and unyielding. Startled, Miles dropped his phone and raised his hands. The tension between them was palpable, the silent street now a stage for an unexpected confrontation. Mark's mind raced, piecing together the scene in front of him. To him, it was all too familiar, a lone teen in a hoodie near a crime scene. Years of experience had trained him to trust his gut, and his gut was telling him that this was no coincidence. His eyes narrowed as he approached, his hand never leaving his weapon. "Step away from the window," Mark ordered, his tone firm. "What are you doing here?" His voice carried the weight of suspicion, each word laced with an assumption. He noticed the tension in Miles' shoulders, the way his jaw tightened, but he dismissed it as a guilty reaction. Mark's rigid beliefs about crime and youth in urban areas clouded his judgment. This was just another case, another statistic waiting to unfold. He questioned Miles aggressively, demanding explanations for why he was out so late and what he was doing near the scene. To Mark, the pieces fit too neatly. A suspicious figure in a known trouble zone. Miles' heart pounded in his chest, his hands trembling slightly as he kept them raised. He struggled to find his voice, his mind racing between anger and fear. "I was calling for help," he finally managed, his voice steady despite the storm within. "I saw the broken window and thought someone should know," but his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. Miles could feel the weight of Mark's gaze, could see the preconceived narrative playing out in his eyes. The disbelief stung more than the situation itself. Here he was, trying to do the right thing, yet instantly judged. This incident shook Miles to his core. He had always believed in justice, in doing the right thing, but now he was questioning that belief. The walk home that used to be a peaceful transition from school to home now felt dangerous, his neighborhood a maze of potential threats. That night marked a shift, altering his routine. He decided to avoid certain streets, keep his hood down, and never stay out late again. Mark continued his interrogation, convinced there was more to Miles' story. "Why were you here at this hour? Do you live nearby?" His questions were sharp, rapid, not giving Miles a chance to breathe between answers. "I told you, I was walking home from the community center. I saw the window and called for help," Miles repeated, his voice steadier this time. He gestured toward his phone, now lying on the ground. Mark eyed it suspiciously, but didn't pick it up. Just then, a dispatch call came through Mark's radio. "Units be advised. We have a confirmed suspect from the electronics store break-in. Description: adult male, wearing a red jacket. Last seen heading east." Mark stiffened. The description didn't match Miles, but instead of easing his stance, he hesitated. "Stay where you are," Mark ordered, as if trying to justify his lingering doubts. Even with the dispatch update, his years of ingrained caution wouldn't let him back down. He scanned the surroundings, his eyes still narrowing at Miles. "You might have been a lookout, or part of a group." Miles exhaled sharply, incredulous. "Seriously? Even after that call? I'm just a kid trying to get home." His words were laced with both anger and exhaustion. The tension thickened, and a small crowd began to gather. neighbors peering out of windows, curious bystanders slowing their pace. The spotlight of misunderstanding had expanded beyond the two individuals. Among the onlookers was Mrs. Jenkins, a middle-aged woman from the neighborhood who recognized Miles. She stepped forward cautiously, her eyes moving between Mark and the teen. "Officer, I know this boy," she said firmly. "Miles tutors my grandson at the community center. He's a good kid. There's no way he'd be involved in this." Mark glanced at her, skeptical. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but you weren't here when this happened." Another voice chimed in, this time a deeper one. It was Mr. Turner, Miles' father, who had rushed over after receiving a frantic text from a friend about the scene. "Officer, that's my son. He's not a criminal. Let's sort this out calmly." Mark's grip on the situation loosened slightly. The presence of others voicing their trust in Miles chipped away at his certainty, but he remained on edge. His partner, Officer Daniels, arrived on the scene, quickly assessing the escalating situation. "Mark," Daniels said, pulling him aside, "we've got a suspect on the run, and this kid doesn't fit the bill. Maybe it's time we reconsider." Mark's jaw clenched as Daniels' words sank in. His partner's logic was sound, and yet something within him resisted. His career had been built on vigilance, on trusting his instincts even when others doubted him. But tonight, doubt was creeping in not just from the bystanders, but from within himself. "What if I'm wrong?" The question gnawed at him. He remembered countless training sessions emphasizing situational awareness, but none had prepared him for this, a moment where his judgment might be clouded by bias rather than facts. He replayed the events in his mind. The broken window, the lone figure, the hoodie. His training told him these were warning signs, but now he saw something else, a scared kid, defending himself against accusations that didn't add up. His hands trembled slightly as he lowered them from his belt. Miles, on the other hand, felt his frustration boil over into something stronger, resolve. He was tired of being seen as a threat just because of his appearance. His voice grew steadier, his stance firmer. "I'm not going to stand here and let you treat me like this," he said, meeting Mark's gaze directly. Mark blinked. The defiance in Miles' eyes wasn't born of guilt. It was born of someone who was done being misjudged. The certainty he had clung to was crumbling, piece by piece. As the tension reached its peak, a voice came over the radio again. "Suspect apprehended. Confirmed stolen merchandise recovered." The air grew still. Mark froze hearing those words, and for the first time, he let go of his preconceptions. He glanced at Miles, then at the crowd, feeling the weight of their stares. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a pivotal moment that would force him to confront everything he believed about the people he thought he was protecting. Something deeper was at play here, and soon he would have to face it. Mark's heart pounded as the radio crackled again. "Suspect confirmed. 28-year-old male, prior offenses. Repeat, no further suspects." Every word hammered away at his resolve, and the weight of his previous assumptions sank in. But it wasn't over yet. Mrs. Jenkins stepped forward once more, clutching something in her hand. "Officer, you might want to take a look at this." She handed over a folded pamphlet. Mark hesitated, then opened it. It was a flyer from the community center, Youth Leadership Program, head mentor, Miles Turner. Below the text was a picture of Miles, smiling confidently, surrounded by a group of kids. Mark's eyes flicked between the photo and the teenager standing in front of him. It was undeniable. Miles wasn't just a bystander. He was a leader in the very community Mark had sworn to protect. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. The same kid he had interrogated with suspicion was the one shaping young minds in a neighborhood struggling to stay afloat. Mark could feel the onlookers' stares growing heavier, as if they, too, were waiting for him to realize the truth. Mark's partner, Officer Daniels, moved closer, scanning the flyer over Mark's shoulder. "He's the one organizing those after-school programs? I've heard about this, helping kids stay out of trouble." Miles, still standing firm, finally spoke up. "Yeah, I'm that guy. I volunteer my evenings to help younger kids avoid making bad choices. But tonight, I guess that didn't matter to you?" His voice was steady, but there was pain beneath his words. Mark's mind raced. How had he missed this? He recalled hearing about the program in precinct meetings. They had praised its success in reducing youth crime rates. Yet here he was, treating the leader of that very initiative like a criminal. Daniels nodded toward Miles. "You Miles Turner? My cousin mentioned you. Said you helped her son get back on track after some rough times. This community owes you." Daniel's words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Mark's breath hitched. Every assumption, every action he'd taken tonight suddenly felt suffocatingly wrong. He glanced back at Miles, who looked more than just frustrated, he looked betrayed. The realization hit Mark like a wave. His rigid belief system, his instinct to see a young black man as a suspect first, protector second, it was crumbling. His chest tightened with guilt. Mark began, struggling for words. His voice faltered. "Miles, I didn't know." Miles cut him off. "You didn't ask. You just assumed." His words were sharp, each one like a blade slicing through Mark's defenses. Mark's gaze dropped to the ground. He'd always prided himself on being fair, on following the law without bias. Yet, tonight, he had let prejudice cloud his judgment. His mind reeled back to the countless faces he had encountered over his career. How many of them had he misjudged because of preconceived notions? The murmurs from the gathered crowd grew louder, their disapproval evident. Mrs. Jenkins shook her head, visibly disappointed. Mr. Turner stepped forward, placing a protective hand on Miles' shoulder. "We need better than this, officer. Our kids deserve better." Mark finally met Miles' eyes, feeling the full weight of his regret. "I was wrong," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I let my assumptions take over. I'm sorry." The words hung in the air, a rare vulnerability from a man who had spent his career hiding behind authority. Miles studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "It's not me you need to apologize to. It's every kid you'll meet after tonight. Don't make the same mistake again." Mark's heart clenched. This wasn't just about one incident. It was a wake-up call. He wasn't just facing Miles. He was confronting himself, his career, and the legacy he would leave behind. The following week, Mark found himself standing in front of the community center where Miles volunteered. The brick building, once a backdrop to his assumptions, now represented a path toward redemption. With a deep breath, he stepped inside, heart pounding. The hall buzzed with energy, kids playing, laughing, learning. In the corner, Miles was leading a group discussion on leadership. Mark hesitated, then approached. The room fell silent as eyes turned toward him. Miles looked up, his expression guarded. Mark cleared his throat. "I'm not here on duty. I'm here to listen and to learn." His words were earnest, but the weight of the moment made them heavier. After a tense pause, Miles nodded. "We've got room." He gestured to a seat. The kids exchanged glances, some skeptical, others curious. But Mark sat down, ready to face their questions and his own misconceptions. Over time, Mark attended more sessions, offering insights from his law enforcement background while absorbing lessons from the community. He volunteered for outreach programs, engaging with families he once viewed through a lens of suspicion. It wasn't just about undoing his past mistakes. It was about rebuilding trust from the ground up. Mark's presence became a regular sight at community events. He worked with local leaders to implement bias awareness training for officers, advocating for empathy and understanding in policing. His colleagues noticed the change. He was more approachable, less reactive, and genuinely invested in community well-being. Miles, too, experienced growth. No longer defined by frustration, he channeled his energy into expanding the mentorship program. With Mark's support, they introduced workshops aimed at fostering dialogue between law enforcement and youth. Walls of misunderstanding began to crumble as shared stories replaced stereotypes. The shift wasn't just in policy, but in perception. Mark's transformation symbolized a broader change in how authority figures engaged with marginalized communities. Respect became mutual, and the once divided worlds found common ground. Mark often reflected on that night, the moment that shattered his worldview. Assumptions blinded me, he would think, realizing how much he had grown. The experience had reshaped him, making him a better officer and, more importantly, a better person. Miles, on the other hand, saw hope where despair once lingered. People can change, he'd remind himself. While trust was earned slowly, he believed in progress. His journey, intertwined with Mark's, became a testament to resilience and the power of understanding. Both men, from vastly different walks of life, had learned that growth begins where prejudice ends. Months later, the community center hosted a joint event, Unity in Action Day. Kids, parents, and officers gathered for games, discussions, and shared meals. At the heart of it stood Mark and Miles. With the crowd watching, they extended their hands. Their handshake wasn't just a gesture, it was a promise. A promise of continued dialogue, mutual respect, and a future where bridges replace barriers. As cheers erupted, Mark glanced at the faces around him. This wasn't just an event. It was a new beginning. Miles smiled, feeling the weight of the past lifting. Together, they had turned conflict into connection, proving that even the deepest divides could be mended. This story reminds us that change starts with acknowledging our biases and embracing empathy. What assumptions have you challenged lately? Share your thoughts below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful narratives about breaking barriers and building bridges. Let's spark conversations that inspire growth and unity.